All right, so moving on. All right, so the first half of chapter 12 talks about business cycles. Now, as you know, as I stated, this circular flow, it ebbs and flows, right? Sometimes we're flowing up and we're growing as an economy, and sometimes we stop and we slow down and we flow downward and we start shrinking as an economy. So what that means is that there are business cycles where we're growing and where we're not. And the nice thing about it is that it is actually always a cycle, all right? So there are 4 phases. The first phase, and again, since it's part of a cycle, part of a circle, there isn't any real starting point. You could start at any one of the 4 points. Just realize that you just keep going from one to the next, to the next, to the next, all right? So the first stage is, in this case, we'll call the recovery stage. The second stage we'll call the peak. The third we will call the recession. And the fourth we will call the trough. So these are just... Sure, you can call it expansion. Pick your favorite word for recession or shrinkage, or, you know, get out the thesaurus and look at all the different synonyms for all those words, right? So you could say, you could say max, you could say min. There's lots of different words to use for... All right, but the idea is behind this is that what happens to GDP, so if we were to graph GDP over time.
I am so excited about this graph right now.
I know, you should be. So this is purely just hand wavy stuff, folks. Don't worry about it. But the idea behind it is that in a recovery, GDP is growing, which means that GDP is going up. But at some stage, as we're growing, we max ourselves out, right? We can only go so far, so fast, and then what happens, right? So here is our recovery stage, or our expansion phase, or our growth phase, whatever you want to call it. And then at some stage, we hit the peak. We hit the maximum growth that we are going to get, and now we start going down, right? So here we start into our recession. And the economy starts shrinking. So for a certain amount of time, the economy will shrink, and then it will hit the bottom, or the trough, if you will. Great word. Anytime you can have a one-syllable word with 6 letters in it, 7 letters in it, that's a good thing. And then after you bottom out, what starts happening to the economy? It starts recovering again. Hence, it goes back through the cycle. Rinse and repeat. Because then you're going to recover. And for a while, you will have recovery again. But eventually, what happens to that recovery? It peaks out, right? It hits its top value. Here's its peak. And when it hits its peak, what does it do? It goes back down again. Ooh. And hopefully the idea behind it is that as you go up, your ups are more than your downs, right?
Do they have like a calculation, like a time frame, like they can see how often you go up?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when's the next down supposed to happen?
Well, when do they think the next one is supposed to happen? That's a tough one, given that the last...
Let's recover first.
Well, we've been recovering for a good 2 years. I mean, our growth hasn't been as big as it normally has been, but we have seen continual growth, right? There was this one burp in the 4th quarter last year where we actually dropped again. But they're expecting growth this quarter, first quarter of 2013, to be another recovery stage. So sometimes these things are very short, right? They could be just 2 or 3 months long. So you may have one goes up really fast and then peaks really quickly and then goes down really fast and then comes back up. I mean, the cycle can be longer or shorter than other times. But the key is that it still just keeps cycling.
Do they have one of these that follows along with election times?
Actually, they haven't been. There isn't, from the statistical analysis, the growth and recession and stages are not tied to election years. Really isn't.
Somebody should try and see.
Oh no, I've tried to run some statistical analysis, and it really, yeah, no.
Like, if you have a free time,
Mm-hmm.
will you have a very steep recession?
Not necessarily, no. There are examples where that has not happened. But at the same time, we have never really had a recovery that over the last 2 years like any other recovery, because our recovery has been so slow. Normally when you get these recoveries, normally that turnaround is really steep, right? When you finally get out of the recession, normally what happens, at least over the last 50, 60 some odd years, is that the recovery comes back really strong. Like when we finally get done being tired of not spending, we spend as an economy. But for the last 2 years here, that hasn't really happened, all right? The biggest difference between this recession that we had in 2009 versus the other ones is, one, it lasted longer, and two, it was also in the housing market instead of in other markets, right? There's been other bubbles, right? The last recession before the housing one was the dot-com bubble, right? That one wasn't, that was sort of a traditional recession. Back in 2001, we had about 2 to 3 quarters worth of recession, and then we turned around and grew again for the next 4 years, 5 years even.
As an aside, where would we be able to follow or track this kind of information?
Oh, you can get it. Yeah, you can get this from the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Okay, thank you.
So the recovery now is so slow, partially because people are, like, I give an extra little bit of money after ordering my savings accounts. I mean, where people are doing that.
Yes. Yes, quit it, you anti-American.
I don't need that house I'm trying to buy.
Yeah, quit it, because you're probably going to buy a used one too, aren't you? You're not going to. Oh!
I don't like new materials.
Okay. All right, so do realize that the reason why we think this growth is relatively slow right now is that if you look historically at the U.S., the growth has generally been, I mean, it's cycled up and down around this 3.5% growth, but generally the growth percentage in GDP over the last 70, 80 some odd years has been, on average, 3.5%. Now, granted, we've been higher than that, and then we've sunk back down lower, and then been higher, and then sunk back down lower. But if you track it, basically this cycle keeps going in and around 3.5%. The only time where it hasn't really followed that has been the last 3 years, where our growth has not come back up to that 3.5% stage, right? Now, the difference, right? If you do a quick graph of what things have looked like the last couple of years, say 5 years, right? The growth that we had back in, say, 2005 was a lot more than 3%. And then when we finally crashed in 2009, what happened is that we crashed down, and now we've had growth, but we haven't gotten back up to that 3.5%, right? So we're sitting here in 2012 below the 3.5% growth rate that we normally expect. And we're really not, we started catching up initially, but now we've started to flatten out. We're still growing, but we're not growing as much as this 3.5%. So we're not getting back up to that stage, and that's what economists are bitching about right now, right? They're upset that we haven't gotten there. And that's why everybody's freaking like, well, we're not growing as much as we used to. Of course, it could be that this 3.5% is not reasonable anymore. I mean, it could be that we as an economy, as a country, just can't grow at 3.5% anymore. We don't have enough infrastructure. We don't have enough new industry being generated in our country to make that happen. All right? So for 4 years, we didn't see a whole lot of new companies start in this country. It was a little scary, and that's what economists were starting to think, oh, crap, we need to start adjusting our figures, right? But what's happened in the last 6 months is that there's been a whole new big pickup in American companies, right? if you look at the West Coast, Silicon Valley, and the Far East Coast, new companies are starting back up. It's just, for whatever reason, it's taken a lot longer than normal. Explanation? Beats the crap out of me. I don't know. And no one else really knows yet. But this growth that we've seen in the last 2 months, right, where unemployment has actually dropped another 0.3%. Economists were looking at it going, that's not going to happen. It did. Why? Well, they're like, holy crap, look at all these companies starting up, and they don't know why. Because it's not like banks have started easing up on loaning money, right? It's not like they're giving out loans to people. Well, that's the next push that they're looking at. They're seeing that money is, instead of coming from banking institutes, it's coming from private investors. And they're not asking for traditional interest payments. They're asking for the microloan type of investment payments.
What about things like Kickstarter or Indiegogo?
Exactly. Those are the sorts of things that are pushing a lot of new industry, right?
Definitely. I know several people that businesses.
Right, yeah, from a $10,000 loan on a small basis, instead of trying to go to a bank who's going to say, oh, $10,000, sorry, you're not worth it. And $10,000 to a bank, folks, it's like a penny to you and me. So, again, it's weird. I don't understand it. I'm still trying to wrap my brain around it. And the statistics do not bear with anything else that we've seen before. So it's a new time. All right, so So what economists have been doing over the past, 50, 60, 70 some odd years has been trying to build up ways to determine when the economy is going to do things. All right? So what they've come up with, they've created 3 types of indicators. And they've given them, there's just 3 different types. Leading indicators. Give yourself room so you can explain. Coincident indicators. Indicators, it's a D, I swear, even though it looks like a C. And lagging indicators. And what these are economic measurements that they can take of the economy and say whether or not those things are going to lead, happen with, or follow behind. Right? So leading indicators, these are predicting measurements. Or when this item or this measurement grows, what we expect is that the economy will grow sometime in the near future. Right? So if a leading indicator grows, economists expect growth in the, and I'll put this in quotes, near future. And again, near is anywhere from 1 week to 6 months. And there's a list of them. Please don't memorize the list. So if you look on page, where are they? Has anybody got it open? 253? Ah, yeah, 254. Right, there's a little table of them. Don't memorize the table. Don't memorize what leading indicators are. Know what they mean. Right? So a leading indicator is an indicator that's going to predict the future. Right? The one that I like to use most is what's known as the Consumer Confidence Index. That's my favorite one because it's the one that has closely mirrored what's happening in the economy in the future in a 3-month time span. So if you look at consumer confidence and then look at the growth in the economy, if you lag them by 3 months, they follow each other. Consumer confidence is interesting little tidbit. You know how they calculate consumer confidence? They ask consumers. That's absolutely right. It's a phone survey. They call up in each region, quote unquote region, where region is some portion of the country. They'll call up 1,000 people and ask them a question. And the question they ask is, how much money are you going to spend next week on the economy? More, the same, or less than you spent this week? That's all they ask. That's it. And what happens is if you say more, they write down a little +1. If you say the same, they write down a little 0. And if you write less, you write down a little -1. They make you guess. Just a guess.
Who did they call?
Random people.
I think I've gotten one of those calls before.
There's 350 million of us, so they randomly call 1,000 of us, right? And the idea then is that they say, okay, from that number, right, if we add up all the +1s, 0s, and -1s, they're going to get a number. And if that number is 60 or more, then we assume that the economy is going to be growing. If it's 55 or less, then it's going to shrink. And spot on, folks, especially over the recession. The consumer confidence number was lower than it had ever been in 2009 and 2010 and 2011, ever. I mean, even compared to some of the other worst recessions we've had, like the 1980s, right? 1981, where we had 10.8% unemployment. Still, consumer confidence was better then than it was in 2009. For whatever reason, we just gave up for a good year and a half.
This is why more people are saving money now.
Right. Uh-huh.
That's why it's such a slow growth.
Yeah. Mhm.
They're afraid to spend the money.
Yeah.
That's what we just went through.
I know. Quit it. Again, it's not a good or a bad thing, just a thing. All right. But if you look at the list, you can look at some of the other leading indicators, right? So money supply, interest rates, consumer expectations, all this sort of, other sorts of things that are going to lead the economy into growth. The reason that consumer confidence is such a good one is that most of our economy, 70% of it, is driven by consumers. Right? 70% of our GDP is us buying crap. So when we start buying more crap, guess what happens? That circle spins a lot faster, right? When we get up into the product market, spend money, businesses get more money, they produce more. Businesses have to produce more. What do they have to do? Eventually, hire more. That's the goal or the hope, depending on how you look at it.
So that's why we have so many disposable items today in today's market.
Oh, yeah, because we want it to be that way.
Things that would normally last us about 15 years, can last us about 3 to 5. We toss it, buy another, buy another, buy
Oh,
another.
yes, come on. The disposable income is exactly what not only the country wants, but all the businesses want, right? So that you have to keep buying new.
I know my computer just crashes for new one.
There you go. Perfect. Adding a GDP. All right, so coincident indicators, right, change with the economy. And the idea is that when these things grow, GDP is growing at the same time. If a coincident indicator grows, GDP is growing with it. My favorite one of these are business orders. And this is the one that NPR also reports on, so that's kind of why I like it too. I'll always hear, once a week when they talk about the economy, Monday mornings, right? Cokie Roberts gets on and starts talking about business orders for last week. It's her classic talk at 6:30 in the morning, right? Business orders, again, the idea here is that if businesses are getting orders, what does that mean? That means that consumers were buying stuff. And businesses don't start making orders right away, right? Because they've almost always got inventory stored away. And so when consumer demand rises, businesses are, normally have a few goods laying around that they can say, okay, I've got some of these in inventory, here they come, you can sell them right now, right? But if orders keep coming, right, if companies are still selling their products and all of a sudden they don't have any in their stores, what do they got to do? They got to make it, right? And those business orders tend to drive us getting hired sooner rather than later, obviously, right? If the business needs to produce more, that's what's going to happen. Now, realize that the businesses always try and fight that, right? The most expensive thing that businesses have to deal with are people. They would really, 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 really like to do away with people if they at all possibly could. I mean, not really, right? But I mean, from an expense perspective, they would really like it, right? Yeah, true. It's one of those where it's sort of a counterintuitive, right? If they fire everybody, then nobody's going to buy their stuff, so... But that's... they still have to deal with it. All right, lagging indicators. These guys change after the economy. So in other words, if a lagging indicator grows, it is because GDP already grew. So lagging indicators change after GDP has grown, right? So if GDP is on the rise and it rises for a good 3 months or a good quarter and a half or something along the lines, these indicators will finally start growing on them. And the classic one for this one is the unemployment rate, the actual percentage, right? And again, the same reason why for this one changing after the fact is that when businesses get orders, they don't hire right away. What they do is they say, ooh, we need to crank out goods. Everybody go back to working full time. And if even then they can't meet the demands, do they hire people right away? No, they say, who wants to work a 60-hour week next week? They say overtime. And all those people who were working part-time for a while go, overtime? You know, sign me up, right? And so we put in our 60, 70-hour weeks, and we do it for a month. We do it for 2 months. We do it for 3 months. Yeah, as long as they keep paying you the overtime. But eventually, 60 or 70-hour weeks, what's going to happen? You're going to get tired. Or they're going to discover that your productivity has fallen, right? Pushing people for 60 to 70 hours a week for longer than a 3-month period tends to lead to productivity dropping. It's a counterproductive, right? Diminishing returns. You can only force somebody to bend over and take it for so long.
What about when they especially have to do like vacation time?
Well, they don't have to give you vacation time. They're supposed to, but they can give you comp time. That's what they give you. But the fact remains is that it's going to take a while for the rise in consumer spending and the rise in business orders to actually start reflecting back on the actual unemployment rate itself. All right. Now, some of the other leading and coincident indicators have to do with unemployment, but it's more along the lines of unemployment claims, right? So when you first start claiming unemployment, that tends to be one that's a negative leading indicator or coincident indicator, right? When there are more people claiming unemployment, what does that mean? There's more people laid off. Well, when there's more people laid off and not working, what do you expect to happen to the economy? Yeah. And if you looked at 2009, the number of unemployment claims that started from 2009 to 2010 rose every quarter for 6 straight quarters. That's the way it was. All right. All right, so know what these indicators mean. Please don't memorize the list. I don't, that's silly, okay? But at the same time, when you start hearing about some of these things that they talk about, right? I mean, if you look at these indicators, you will hear them talk about, well, new consumer goods orders are up, right? And you'll say, oh, wait, that was one of those leading indicator things. Or it'll say something like industrial production, right? Industrial production's on the rise. That's a coincident indicator. That's one that's going to change at the same time, right? Or obviously you're going to hear the unemployment rate went down or up, depending on whichever one. And again, you'll now think, wait, that always lags, right?
Extra credit?
Find one?
Can you find one?
Yeah, for extra credit.
The news? Yeah, we'll work on it. I got a better extra credit one for
All right.
later.
I'm trying.
All right, so that takes us through the business cycles. Any questions on the business cycles? No? Okay, hopefully that one's, not too bad. It tends to be, here are the 4 cycle phases. Make sure you know them. Here are the 3 types of indicators. Know what? Now here comes the interesting part, right? Because the other half of chapter 12 talks about unemployment. And unemployment is another one of those just messed up things too. All right, so this really takes us through the whole GDP portion, right? We've gotten through GDP and economic growth. That's the first goal of economic growth. Second one, full employment. So we need to explain what do we mean by full employment. Hopefully what unemployment means is relatively straightforward, right? You guys know that unemployment means not working. Okay. Now, the question is, how do we calculate it? Well, technically the way you measure the unemployment rate, so the unemployment rate is equal to the number of unemployed workers in the economy divided by what's known as the civilian labor force. And then we multiply that number by 100 to convert it into a percentage, right? Because we like to say that the unemployment rate is 7.9%. All right? In order to do that, you always have to multiply by 100. So here is the straightforward, real easy way to measure the unemployment rate, right? Yes and no. So first of all, you were probably wondering, what the hell is that? What is the civilian labor force?
How many people in the nation?
You would think that's what it means, right? It's the number of people that could be working in the United States. Well, where do we measure whether or not you could be working? How old do you have to be to work? 16 plus, right? So the first thing the civilian labor force is the number of people. First, they have to be older than 16, right? If you are working and are under the age of 16, you are not affecting unemployment rates at all, okay? Doesn't matter. If you're 15 and working, you are not making the unemployment rate smaller. You are not. Doesn't matter.
You're not counting.
You don't count. You just don't count. So you don't change anything, right? So even if you're 15 and you are looking for a job and you consider yourself unemployed, you also are not affecting the numbers, period. Okay? You've got to be 16 before anybody gives a crap about you.
Isn't that the truth?
Disabled, but they're 18 and 20.
Now, there are exceptions. Let me get to the exceptions first, right? So, number of people that are 16 plus and are either employed or unemployed. And then there are with exceptions.
What about legal citizens?
Those are not in there, right? And we'll see why in a little bit, right? So the first thing things that are exceptions. The military is not counted in the civilian labor force. So if you work full-time for the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, you are not affecting unemployment numbers, period. No, it's just because you're not a part of the civilian labor force, right? You're part of the military labor force, and we define our unemployment by civilians, and people who are warriors, in theory, are not civilians. Whatever. Now, again, think about it, though. How many people are in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines? How many Americans are there?
An effing lot.
Yeah, I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of them. They are not counted in the unemployment rate.
That's an accurate number she just used.
Right?
An effing lot.
So the problem then is if we counted them. I mean, if you're working for the Army full time, do you have a full time job?
Yes.
Yeah. So shouldn't you count?
No.
Why not? You're employed.
You're not a civilian.
You're special.
Exactly. You're not a civilian. But why does civilian make a difference to the unemployment rate? You're still an American. I'm being paid by the government, but I'm part of the civilian labor force.
Because you're not trained to kill people.
Why does killing have anything to do with it?
You don't carry.
The numbers are already counted when you're in the military.
In the military compared to
No.
Isn't that considered in the government terms like a transfer payment sort of? 'Cause
No, it's work, right? I mean,
Does it have to do with the fact that, like, if you're in the military, you're working, there's no, like, unemployment or layoffs? Like, it just is.
it just is, yes.
So you can't-
Yeah, I mean, that's why they ignore it, is because you're just, you're sort of not really a part of the workforce. But, I mean, they're working, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so why wouldn't we want to count them?
Are they not producing?
I don't know, didn't they just lay off a bunch of them in the sequestration anyways?
Not in the military, right? They laid off a bunch of they laid off a bunch of the service members, right? They didn't lay off any of the actual military members, the guys who were carrying the guns and whatnot. They didn't have any reduction in their pay or
Non-service.
right, non-service oriented people, right?
They provide a service for us.
They certainly are providing a service, aren't they? I mean, hello, they're out there making sure that people aren't coming into our country and killing us, right?
Yeah. Let's
So-
count them in the military numbers, which is a whole different.
Honestly, I don't know why. I was hoping one of you did.
But you're teaching us.
Yeah, so you may have insight to this that I don't know about.
My friend's battalion just had.
But that's the way it works, right? So the key here is if we didn't count the military in the unemployment rate, what would happen to the unemployment rate?
It would increase.
It would go up.
It would lower.
It would go down, right? Because all those people are working, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, that would be more employed people. So this whole unemployment saying it's 7.9%, that's baloney. If we would just include the military, it'd go down to like 5%.
That would affect their branch funding. You can't do that.
Yeah, but it doesn't, no. Unemployment has nothing to do with funding, period.
Count military money into civilian money.
But this has nothing to do with money. This is just how we calculate the rate.
That's how they look at it.
No, they just care. This is how they calculate the rate. That's it.
Is it our donations that are feeding the military?
I mean,
If by donations you mean
taxes.
Oh, that's just extra niceness. that you
Yes,
give
that's
us.
true. But the fact remains is that unemployment is really too high. Because if we would just start including the military in our unemployment numbers, it'd go way down. I mean, think about adding a potential 500,000 to 1 million people to the unemployment rate, and all of them have a job. So why did they use civilian labor force? Why don't they just call it the labor force instead of the civilian labor force? Me neither. So why do they keep doing that? That's outdated. This whole unemployment rate thing, it's baloney. It should be a lot lower. The economy's a lot better than you think it is. Quit whining.
Oh, right. I'll start that immediately.
You're not going to win here.
They counted them in the numbers of,
No, they are neither employed nor unemployed.
so how would it make unemployment go down if they're not being counted at all?
Well, because if we did count them, all of them would have a job, right?
As opposed to how many percent, what the percentage is now, would I?
Right. Yeah. So what I'm telling you right now is that everybody who says the unemployment is really high, I'm like, so what? Just add the military and boom, it'll go way down. And sure seems like that would be not a wrong thing to do. Right? Because we exclude them right now, but those people are working. Why don't we include them? Oh,
Take
well.
unemployed people and put them in the military.
That's sort of what the government used to try and do. It doesn't work anymore for whatever reason. I'm trying. I'm standing up here and telling you to call your elected official and tell them that the unemployment rate calculation is wrong. They should quit using this civilian labor force thing and just call it labor force and count the military.
So it's a government thing to the economy because they're still spending
Yeah.
on the military.
Yeah, no,
Just
it's-
the
yep.
unemployment number.
Yep, yeah, all this number, right, which everybody is screaming about because it's like 7+%. E-I-O, E-I-O. And
And see, the thing
They're
is,
screaming back.
still counted when they leave.
right, yeah, when they leave the military and then they're looking for a job, right, then all of a sudden they do. Right.
So it's still counted in one way or the other.
Well, no, but I mean, when you're in the military, you're actively in the military, you're not anywhere in the numbers, period. You're excluded. So it's like, that's silliness, right? Okay.
It's as hard to get a job in the military as it is anyplace else.
True.
Military people have to pay taxes?
No.
When they're active, they don't. When they're not active, they do. All right, so other things that are excluded from the civilian labor force. Full-time students are ignored.
Oh, thank you.
Yay!
So all of you who are full-time students legally, right, so however many credits that represents, even if you're looking for a job, you are actually excluded from the numbers. You're also still excluded from the numbers. So you're not helping the economy by being a full-time student and working. Yeah.
Until we enter the economy as
Yeah, they're adding to GDP. But they're not making the unemployment number lower, and that's what we want, right? That's one of the things that we want.
So,
Marshall, wait, the reason they're not doing that is because this is not an exact science.
Oh, hell yeah, brother.
2009, from 2009, when like the economy went into the toilet and people started, like people were laid off at GM and they started
Mhm,
going
mhm.
into education and
Mhm,
became
mhm.
full-time students,
Mhm.
that was part of what plummeted, that
Yes.
well, I guess rose the unemployment number.
Well, no, the unemployment number shrank when GM first laid them all off. That first 2 weeks where you actually collected unemployment before you became a full-time student, unemployment number shot way up.
Right.
As soon as they got their severance package that allowed them to start being students, it went way down because now they got removed from the unemployment ranks. Yeah, you're removed from the equation. It was perfect.
Which is still all messed up.
In that example, they were probably still getting unemployment checks.
Oh yeah, unemployment checks and unemployment rate are totally separate numbers, folks, by the way. Yeah.
We'll get you a different category.
No, and why do they get them? Why do they get them?
That unemployment payments are something totally separate than this number. They're actually even done by different governmental departments. Who pays you and who counts you, totally different. They have no idea who's talking to whom. So you could be getting an unemployment check and be fully employed, right? Because they don't know, right? And if you're cleverly hiding the fact that you're fully employed, yeah, you can keep collecting unemployment checks, right? Why not?
Because the fine for that is,
If they went and worked at McDonald's, they'd still get unemployment.
We paid an example of one job.
Yes,
Unemployment check.
Yep, All right, so other people that are removed from this equation, right?
Teachers.
Disabled individuals and institutionalized individuals.
Like I said, teachers.
Well, those should be institutionalized as opposed to are. So if you are disabled, again, if you are working or not working, you're out of the numbers, folks. I mean, if you are legally considered disabled, again, I don't know what that means necessarily. It's, again, collecting and being are totally separate numbers.
what about people who are disabled, but they're allowed to earn, like my mother, for instance, is disabled, but she's allowed to have a job that she does not earn more than $800 a month at.
That's just so that she's guaranteed disability payments. As opposed to whether she's counted in the numbers, it's purely whether or not she's considered disabled by the government.
So even if she's disabled and has a job, she's still considered,
Disabled, and so they would say, nope, you're not in the
so
numbers.
she doesn't.
Yep, she doesn't count. Yep, she wouldn't be reducing the unemployment rate by working, even though technically she probably should.
Right.
Right?
That's just, if you're working,
Yep, that's just how they decided to do it, right?
This whole thing is messy.
Oh yeah, it's really mess. Unemployment is one of the ugliest numbers, right? This is even worse than GDP, folks. And again, this is another one of those things where I'm like pointing out to you, everybody is screaming and crying about the unemployment rate. Do they have any clue how it's calculated? No.
I'm not counting twice.
So the key here is realizing that there are definite exceptions to the rule, all right? All right, so hopefully the other exceptions are things that belong in the exceptions, right? So hopefully if you're retired, you really shouldn't count towards unemployment, right? I mean, if you finally retired your job and are now not working, I mean, theoretically, you really shouldn't be counted, right? You shouldn't be a part of these figures. Right, so the question, though, is how do you differentiate these disabled people versus a retired person?
Social Security, disability, and Social Security, the SSI versus SSD.
Right, I mean, what's the difference, right? I mean, and
A letter.
yeah, and the problem with it is the government really, I mean, how are they going to distinguish them? That's tough to do. It's really hard. That's being used to pay them comes from the same pot. So it,
Medicaid versus Medicare.
yeah, it's essentially the same thing. So that's kind of why these two are really the same thing.
What if you're retired from one job, but you are now working right now?
You're not retired.
Then you're not. Yeah, that one's okay.
The original.
But it doesn't matter though. Technically, as long as you've got a job, if you're over this 16. So if you retire at 55 and then get another job at 56, technically you're back in the workforce. All right.
You can still be getting a pension. So
True.
If you think, someone's getting a retirement check, they might be retired from that position. That's how they work.
Yeah, but if they are working, they actually still count. So unlike the student and the military, those things don't. Those things override.
So like my uncle who did 20 years in the
He was, if you're,
He was exempted from.
well, if you're National Guard, it depends on whether you're full-time National Guard. Yeah, so if he's probably just doing the
Count as a sheriff, and he was in the National Guard.
right. National Guard is not a part of the military technically, because in order to become, if you can become part of the military from the National Guard if you are made active, but it actually moves you from being National Guard to being Army regular or Navy regular or whatever, and then you do become military, and then you are removed from the numbers, even though you may still have your job. So my brother-in-law, he worked for he works for InBev, and he got called up for 15 months to go to Iraq. While he was in Iraq for 15 months, he did not count towards the unemployment numbers because he was in the active military. Once he came back and started up his job again, now he did. Now he started counting towards the numbers again. It's funky, but that's the way it works.
You pull out of the workforce. That's what I was talking about. Your job is held for you.
Is there a,
True, technically.
Yeah.
is there a science behind why they do it that way, or they just decided to do it that way?
It's morphed as it's grown.
What about illegal U.S. citizens?
Technically, they're not a part of the civilian labor force because they're not a part of the quote-unquote, they're not civilians, right? You're not civilian if you're not an American, technically.
What about green card or?
Don't count. Nope.
They don't count.
Don't count. Not in our numbers.
So even though you consider a civilian, you have a green card, you're not.
Part of the civilian labor force. Nope.
Not fully and legally.
Yep, you're not a legal citizen. Until you renounce your other citizenship and become a U.S. citizen, you don't count towards U.S. unemployment rate.
They're just taking up jobs that
That theoretically would do, right? I mean,
Yeah.
theoretically.
Thank you, theoretically.
Theoretically, yeah, because everybody wants to go and plunge toilets for a living.
Well, there's nothing wrong with it, right? Okay, so this takes us then to what does the government consider employed, right? So we've defined what it means to not be in the numbers. So here are a group of people who are not in the numbers, right? These are, we don't even count them. So now how do we get people who are in there, okay? So one of the things that we do is they have to be part of this civilian labor force, so not one of these things, the exempted things, and be 16 and older. And they need to be employed. So what does it mean to be employed? Well, this is all it takes for the government to consider you employed. If you worked 1 hour and you got paid for it through payroll, you are employed.
And it has to be taxes taken out.
Yeah, it needs to be legal. That's all it takes, though.
That's lame.
They don't call it the underemployment rate. They call it the unemployment rate. So if you worked an hour last week, you were employed, period. Right? Again, as long as you weren't in one of these categories, right? Or work for 15 plus hours, not for pay, somewhere else. So imagine if your family owns a restaurant and your dad came in and said, look, the dishwasher quit. We don't have one for this week. Guess what? You're going to wash dishes for the restaurant this week. Welcome aboard, right? And of course, is dad going to pay for the 17-year-old, bum who's going to school for working 15 to 20 hours at his restaurant?
I pay your car payment.
True, he maybe pays him under the table, right? But he doesn't hire him so that he doesn't have to pay payroll taxes and pay unemployment insurance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he just says, here's $20 for doing it. But the fact remains is that if you worked for 15 hours and were not paid, you were considered employed, period. If he was a full-time student, yes, maybe he was a part-time student.
how do they know?
Because when he asked him, are you a full-time student? He said no.
How do they know that they work?
Because when they call you on the survey and they ask, did you work 1 hour for pay? And he would say, no, I didn't. Did you work 15 plus hours but did not get paid? And he's like, oh yeah, I did. And then immediately they say, great, thank you, and they check you off on the employed box and hang up. This is all done by phone surveys, by the way, folks. All of this stuff.
It's a
So
national
15 plus hours of volunteer work
That's enough. You are now employed.
considered employed.
That's absolutely right.
So like 1 week you could be employed, the next week you may not be.
Yeah, uh-huh. Yeah, that's the idea. This is why they do the phone survey every week, right? And again, it's one of those where You know, at some stage they'll call you, maybe. Again, I don't know how they randomly call numbers, but they do.
They flip through the phone book and go,
Essentially, yeah. I mean, it's a little weird, but that's how they do it, right? Okay, so the last thing then, so this is where you're employed, all right? So if you say yes to either of those numbers, you are employed. The last thing they ask you when they call you up on the phone is, if you say no to both of those, they ask, did you look for work?
they ask that when you file for unemployment.
That, but again, totally separate thing, though. Theoretically, to collect unemployment, you're supposed to, you know, at least fill out 2 job applications per week and prove it, that sort of thing, right? Yeah. But this one, they just ask. They don't have to prove jack diddly squat. If you said yes to did you look for work last week, this is when you are considered unemployed. If you answered no to that question, yes. If you say no, you are removed from the numbers. You're actually removed from the civilian labor force. So if you gave up, right? So maybe you were unemployed for like 2 years, and finally at this stage you're like, okay, I filled out an application for every 2 weeks. I filled out at least 2 applications, and I got my unemployment check. Great. But now 2 years later, government's finally cut you off. Right? You're not getting any more unemployment checks. So do you bother to look for work anymore? No. Why bother, right? So now when they call your house and they ask you these questions, they ask, did you work for an hour? No. Did you work for 15 hours without pay? No. Did you look for work? No. Then what they do is they actually remove you from the civilian labor force.
For how long?
For a week. Until you look for a work again, right? That's the 5th category down here. These are what's known as discouraged workers.
Yeah.
Yeah, true. So realize that that last question is actually what removes you from the civilian labor force potentially, all right? But again, in order to be considered employed in the country, 1, you have to be in the civilian labor force, so not any of the exceptions in 16. And worked for an hour or worked for 15 hours with no pay. That makes you unemployed. If you, as long as you didn't do either of those and you looked for work, then they will unemployed. If you say no to that last question, you actually slide out of the civilian labor force. And again, at the end of that, the recession, when unemployment actually started to go down, a lot of the reasoning that people were giving was that this category was growing, right? People were running out of unemployment payments, and so they quit bothering to even look, even if what they were looking for before was baloney anyways, right? But now they even quit bothering to do that, right?
So it only goes off of those surveys. They don't ask each college
Nope.
how many full-time students.
Nope. It's all surveys, and you could be completely dishonest if you want while they call you. Homework? We didn't quite finish all of 12, but and 10. There's one piece that we need to do.